Hi, everyone. Welcome to FutureX, a panel series where we host some of the brightest minds in crypto. Today, we have with us here Matthew Kulkin, the partner of global law firm Steptoe Johnson and former CFTC director. Matthew, thanks again for being here.
Thanks, Mark. Happy to be here.
Great. Before we get started, could you just give the audience a brief introduction on yourself, what you do at the law firm, and maybe a little bit of your background at the CFTC?
Sure, thanks. So I am, this will get everyone really excited. I am a financial services regulatory lawyer. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I'm part of a global law firm called Steptoe Johnson, based in Washington, but with offices in Chicago and New York and London and Brussels and Hong Kong. And so our team helps financial services companies navigate the financial services regulatory landscape. I've been working in financial services for almost 20 years now. I worked through the financial crisis, leading up and through the Dodd-Frank Act in the US Congress, and the implementation of that at the various regulators here in the United States. I also had the privilege to serve at the CFTC, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, as one of the 4 division directors under Chairman Chris Giancarlo, who's affectionately known as Crypto Dad. And so I was part of his senior team and led the efforts during his tenure.
Awesome. So sounds like you know a little bit about the regulatory landscape.
A little bit, yes. We spend a lot of time advising clients on U.S. regulation, and so it's been really interesting to see. I've been out of government for about 2.5 years now, and just the explosion of interest in U.S. markets, U.S. persons, and the development of technologies and ideas and innovation. It's really an exciting time.
Great. And so for some of the audience who may not be aware, could you tell us a little about what the CFTC does and its role both inside and outside crypto?
Sure. So the U.S. has a number of different regulators that each have their own jurisdiction and their own mission. The CFTC historically has been focused on, as the name suggests, commodities and futures. So looking at agriculture products, looking at commodity products, and regulating the markets, specifically futures markets, swaps markets, and options markets. It's only in the last 5 or so years that the CFTC's jurisdiction has expanded with the designation of Bitcoin and Ethereum as commodities. And so the CFTC's jurisdiction right now is really limited to the derivatives, not the underlying spot markets. There is some jurisdiction in the underlying cash markets for these commodities with respect to fraud and manipulation. And then there's a very heated debate going on our Capitol Hill with our Congress, trying to figure out whether additional authority is needed for any of the agencies, whether that's the CFTC or the Securities and Exchange Commission or the bank regulators, to figure out who should have specific oversight of the underlying commodity markets, or the underlying cash markets.
Great. Thanks so much for the overview. So we also have with us here, Matt Liu, the Chief Strategy Officer of SynFutures. You want to give yourself a quick intro, and then we can kick off the first set of questions.
Thank you, Mark. Hi, this is Matt. I'm usually known as Matt, the finance guy, and we're very glad to have today. We have Matt, the lawyer, as well, because I did many years of finance stuff, FX trading, financing, etc. Before joining the SynFutures team. So I help manage on the business side of the SynFutures project. Matthew, thank you. We have been reading that this new executive order signed by President Joe Biden. In fact, on that very day, we saw Bitcoin price went up, right? So seems it's a positive news by reading the market price. What does it mean in your eyes, or in the regulators' eyes, for this executive order?
Yeah, it's interesting. So the executive order was long awaited. There was a lot of speculation about what it would or wouldn't say. And what I think the positive reaction was that the executive order didn't set forth new policy. It did not impose new rules right away. In fact, it's really more of a plan for a plan. It's a very deliberative process. So if you haven't seen, and I'll plug, our law firm wrote a nice summary of the executive order. It's at steptoe.com. We have a chart that lays out all of the reports and all of the deliverables that are required. But really, so what the executive order is it's a list of reports and studies that demonstrates for the first time really what they call a whole of government approach to policymaking. And it's really comprehensive. It covers our Treasury Department, our markets regulators, our national security offices, and sort of everyone in between. And it lays out a number of reports, I think there are 14, that need to be completed somewhere between 60 days and 210 days. And so what does this mean for the markets? It means nothing's going to happen in the near future. There had been a lot of speculation that the executive order might give the SEC or the Treasury or the CFTC specific orders to do something, and it doesn't. Instead, it asks all of them to work together and develop a framework, develop recommendations for a plan. And so this is going to take some time. Many of the deadlines go after our congressional, what are called midterm elections, where we expect that the Republican Party, the minority party, might take control, which is the opposite of President Biden's party, which makes for more friction in the policymaking arena. And so we have to wait and see. But it also means that the SEC and some of the more aggressive or more outspoken agencies have to slow down a little bit, and they have to work more closely with their counterparts to develop these policies, and they can't really go at it alone.
Are there any agencies in particular that everyone in the industry should be paying attention to beyond the SEC and the CFTC?
That's an interesting question. So probably we have something called the Financial Stability Oversight Council. It's sort of the intergalactic chamber of U.S. financial regulation. It's a group of 10, and it was created after the financial crisis. But it's sort of the forum where the Treasury, the bank regulators, the SEC, the CFTC, insurance experts, where they're supposed to come together. It's staffed by the Treasury Department officials, and it's supposed to be sort of the clearinghouse for a lot of ideas, not just crypto. And so I think where the executive order looks to, it's called the FSOC, the Financial Stability Oversight Council, where the executive order looks to the FSOC, I think you'll see a lot of consensus building, and the policies and the recommendations that come from FSOC will really reflect sort of the whole of government for this administration.
Thanks, Matthew. To my knowledge, actually, U.S. is the first country to have such a, let's say, countrywide address of the entire cryptocurrency issue and future development, right? By judging from this executive order, I have not yet seen any other countries signing anything with such a, I would say, large frameworks. So what's your view on this one? You think U.S. is definitely leading the development of these frameworks among all other countries, or it's more reactive to let's say other countries developing their CBDCs, etc.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it's a combination, right? So there's the U.S. is different than some countries, particularly some countries where virtual currencies are growing. In that we have just a lot of different federal regulatory bodies and a lot of different offices that have to coordinate, and that's different than other jurisdictions, particularly smaller jurisdictions where there's just one office or there's a more centralized source of power. And so, in the US, we've seen tokens are deemed securities, Bitcoin is deemed a commodity. Our tax authority, the Internal Revenue Service, has said that crypto is a property. And so those each have different legal ramifications. And so it's sort of necessary that we have this whole of government approach to bring consistency. But then, to your question, some of it is also about global competition and wanting to attract and retain talent and markets and innovation in the US, like we have with our more traditional capital markets, and giving people a clear sense of the rules of the road so that they know what to expect, but also that they want to come and stay here and do business here.
I see. Thanks. On that point, today I actually came across a very interesting map. Let me see if I can very briefly share it. Oh, I think Mark, you can probably pass me the sharing.
Okay, 1 second.
Sure.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, awesome. So this is an interesting map I saw earlier today, which maps out the crypto regulation friendliness by country around the world, right? So at first glance, I was looking at it, I'm like, okay, this is a developed country thing this way. So green means more friendly, red means more hostile, yeah. But then the paradox has always been, people are talking about cryptocurrency, talking about, DeFi and the whole technology to be more helpful for developing countries, especially the people there, for financial democratization, right? Yet those with a friendlier regulatory frameworks are the developed countries. So, I mean, this is to Matthew as well as to Mark. What's your view on this paradox, you think? Yeah.
Well, look, this is an interesting map. Capital, whether fiat or crypto, it's nimble, it's liquid, and I saw this when I was in government, right? Capital and the people behind it, they're going to go where they can do business, where they can innovate, but also where they know with certainty how they're going to be regulated. And so, some of these jurisdictions are not surprising, both green and red, in terms of places that financial services companies want to do business and where they want to set up shop and grow. And similarly, we've seen people move across borders in response to market events or in response to regulatory events. So yeah, this looks pretty familiar.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the spot where I am now here, Singapore, but it's way too small. But I think I found it earlier. It was green. Yeah. So yeah. Yeah.
Okay, great. So let's jump into DeFi, because I know DeFi is a topic a lot of people are curious about as it relates to regulation. So Matthew, can you give us a quick overview of where we are today with DeFi regulation, and what are some of the kind of regulatory kind of concerns that pop up around this space?
Yeah, so I'll speak to this generally with respect to the United States, although I think what I'll say probably applies pretty consistently around the world. You know, my experience with DeFi and DeFi companies either trying to comply with regulation or trying to operate in a way such as to not trigger jurisdiction by certain places. It's a bit of we call it a square peg in a round hole. And what I mean by that is regulators are generally always a step behind the markets, and there's a bit of a reactionary element there. And so we're certainly leaps and bounds ahead of where we might have been even just a couple of years ago, but there's still a lot of learning that needs to take place. So far, and this is not a new dynamic, but so far, the attitude is a little bit of a, you need to comply with our rules. The way they're written should be fine, and you need to squeeze in. But you know, in the U.S., we currently have 4 nominees to take seats at the CFTC as commissioners, and our U.S. Senate needs to confirm them first. And so we had a hearing just a few weeks ago featuring the candidates, the nominees, and they're talking about these issues, these very complicated, these very new issues, and members of Congress from rural agricultural states were asking about DeFi protocols and autonomous regimes, and that is really you know, a testament to the industry engaging and educating so that these questions can even be asked. But you know, that's step one. The rules are still the rules at the CFTC that were largely written almost 50 years ago, and written for soybean futures contracts and precious metals. And they're being used now to, you know, what used to be a market for farmers is now being used to regulate virtual currencies and DeFi protocols. So we've got a long ways to go. There's certainly not specific rules for DeFi, and that would take time. But the regulators are interested, for better or for worse, and they're asking questions and doing their investigations, and so things are underway.
And from your perspective, like, how deep does, you know, regulators' knowledge in DeFi go at the moment?
Yeah, so I mean, that really depends on the person. At the SEC, you know, Chairman Gary Gensler spent time working at the Massachusetts Institute for Technology, where he led academic research in this market. So he's very articulate, and he has brought in some senior staff to support him, who are very knowledgeable in this space. There are other policymakers who are less familiar, but they understand that something is happening, and so they're interested. They're learning, but they might not have that same hands-on experience. You know, I think the best example of that is from last year at the CFTC. There was a commissioner. His name is Dan Berkovitz, and he gave a speech where he said basically that he recognizes DeFi's disruptive nature, but he said it needs to fit within the existing system. He pointed to customer protection concerns, anti-money laundering, fraud, manipulation. And so his point was, if you're a market, we have a regime for markets. If you're an intermediary, we have laws for intermediaries. Come and register and follow our rules. Now, Commissioner Berkovitz is no longer Commissioner Berkovitz at the CFTC. He's now the general counsel at the SEC, where he's supporting Chairman Gensler. And I don't want to overanalyze his speech from a year ago when he had a different job at a different agency, but I think that's illustrative of how some policymakers are approaching these new ideas.
And for these like the approaches, right, by the regulators and increasing number of investigations or studies by the regulators, would you think this would come, to the detriment of DeFi innovation, or you think this will help, boost the DeFi innovations?
So I think it can be both. I have a partner who recently joined our team who worked as a senior official at the SEC. And she often says, the investigation itself is the penalty. It's not so much about the outcome of an investigation or the potential fine that might be paid at the end. It's the months or years of investigations, of legal fees, of responding to inquiries, producing documents, emails, knowing you're being watched. That in and of itself can be the penalty. And so that's not good for innovation. That's not good for helping companies that are particularly in their early days, helping them grow and mature. But at the same time, when those cases are finished and they're announced and they're made public, the rest of us get to learn from them. We refer to that as regulation by enforcement or policy making by enforcement, which is not the preferred way for a government to develop policy. But sometimes that's the only information we have to go on. And so we certainly have to follow those developments very carefully. I think, and Chair Gensler has given speeches where he has said, if you're a trading platform with 50 tokens, the chances are pretty remote that none of the tokens are securities. And they're going to look at this very carefully. And that, similarly, if a lending platform is offering a security, the SEC is going to look at it. He's called it the Wild West, and he wants to bring law and order to the Wild West. And so companies have to take that seriously, right? It's just a speech or a paper, but that's coming from a major US regulatory authority and the leader of it. And so companies have to respond to that accordingly. So we'll have to see. I mean, these are the early days. It's not unlike a lot of other new innovation, peer-to-peer lending or some of the products that have come out of markets in the last 10 or 20 years. It just takes, 3 to 5 years for the regulator to catch up to that innovation and provide some direction for the market.
Yeah, and actually on the direction of the market, I agree with you that will actually be critical because, today DeFi only have, a couple of million users in total because Metamask has 30 million monthly active users. So sometimes people have multiple accounts. So I would expect somewhere between 5 to 10 million real people. But then with the growth that many of the entrepreneurs like Mark and me, we build in, we believe, this number going to grow tenfold in the next couple of years, right? And then if we're rolling out products, right, to, 100 million people, 200 million people around the world, it will be really hard to imagine it comes in a completely unregulated format, right? So then, some sort of compliance and regulation, at a reasonable level, is very widely expected by the entrepreneurs in the industry. But of course, how and when and in what format, right, that's the answer. Still hanging there. So hopefully, we got enough efforts and vision together with the regulators to work this out, right, in the next couple of years.
Yeah, and just to Matt's point, so I think everyone in the industry does agree that some regulation is good for the space, as it matures, right? It'll help bring in, more builders. We're also institutions who are looking to get into DeFi. I often speak to a lot of people on the institutional investing side, and they'd love to explore DeFi. It's just it's a somewhat gray area right now. So how do we drive responsible and well-informed regulatory frameworks without stifling innovation, right? So, I would say it's in the country's national interest to keep this landscape as competitive as possible without stifling growth, while also meeting kind of the regulatory requirements. Do you have any thoughts on how we could kind of move forward in this space?
Yeah. So, and you sort of alluded to the balance, right? The puzzle that all policymakers struggle with, particularly in the United States, is that on the one hand, they want to attract markets, they want to attract capital, they want to attract innovators, but at the same time, their mission, their statutory assignment from Congress is to protect investors and protect market integrity. And it's that balance, right? And so we've already seen a lot of this, but it's really about engagement, direct engagement with policymakers, so that your first conversation isn't in the form of a subpoena or in the rejection of a registration application. It's meeting with the policymakers at the agencies and their staff, meeting with members of U.S. Congress on Capitol Hill, joining the industry trade associations, developing educational materials, speaking at every event possible, doing that outreach, certainly working with counsel on your specific project to make sure you're not running afoul of any bright lines, and asking a lot of questions, because sometimes on both sides of the conversation, people don't even know what question to ask. And so it's only by having those conversations and not just one, multiple rounds, do people really start to understand what's being discussed, which leads to recommendations for policy, which leads to sometimes a new law, sometimes a new rule, sometimes an exemption. And it's a slow process. It takes months, if not years.
So how early would you say a DeFi project should start kind of taking some of these measures, trying to strike some, at least open a channel for dialogue with regulators? And then what is the best way to approach that? What channels should you use? I guess, from an early stage, where do you begin?
So I think that depends. It depends from a US based perspective. It depends if you want to do business in the US. If you do, then engaging early makes sense. And I should plug, the CFTC has a program called Lab CFTC. The SEC has a similar program, but it's sort of like a fintech sandbox, in the sense that they have made staff available. They have published materials that are designed to help companies understand the jurisdiction's rules, mission, policy, but they also take meetings. They don't provide legal advice, but they will refer you to other resources to help understand what's going on. So that's one. The second is that a lot of the industry groups, and there are a number of them, a lot of the industry groups are a great place for startups to come together and exchange ideas, tips and tricks, learn from each other's mistakes and successes, and also engaging through an industry group directly with policymakers. It takes a little bit of the spotlight off of your individual company. And so it allows you to go in and talk with the SEC or the Treasury or the CFTC as a group with a collective position or a collective interest in a policy, rather than coming in to speak specifically about your business.
Matthew, I was reading the news earlier, actually, because the institution coming into crypto and coming into DeFi attracts so much attention. And recently, there's a very high-profile case where Goldman Sachs made a non-deliverable OTC option trade with Galaxy Digital, right? So, I mean, with a banking background myself, I would imagine they have passed all the legal and compliance team and probably have consulted with the regulator before hitting that trade button. Do you see that's a big step for institutions to come in under a regulatory framework? Let's say after the President Biden's executive order?
Yeah, so I want to be careful that I don't speak to any like a specific trade between specific parties, but yes, I mean there is in this area there is some regulatory uncertainty, and so you need someone to take the lead. I would assume very carefully and after a lot of diligence, but you need someone to take that first move. And we'll have to see what the ripple effects are, both from the market and from the regulator, in terms of trying something that's never been done before. And so, to your point, these are institutional market participants with, long track records of being compliant and careful with respect to laws and regulations. So we'll see what happens next.
Yeah, thanks. Fingers crossed. One day the TradFi world and the DeFi world can meet like even closer, where probably some institutions will come to do more DeFi stuff. That's what we're preparing for. What we're building for.
Yeah. And look, it's evidence that not just retail, but also institutional market participants are looking to do more and do new things. And in some cases, they're seeking permission, and in other cases, they're going to seek forgiveness. But in either case, they're moving forward.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That's a good point. And I do see a lot of institutional firms that, when they do want to explore DeFi, especially the ones based in the US, they'll look to do it through like an offshore entity. So I know there is some activity on that front, but hopefully there's a clear regulatory guideline for how institutional participants can get involved.
Yeah, and on that front, I'd say it's still the dust has not settled on sort of what is sufficient, or what's enough of a US nexus for a regulator to say they have jurisdiction, or for the market participant to say we're clearly outside of that regulator's jurisdiction. So we frequently tell clients, be careful, document what you're doing and why you're doing it. Check your customer list, be careful when you're onboarding, check your geo-blocking and make sure you're doing things to check physical location, refresh your terms of service and other things like that to make sure you're clear about where people can participate. But also, particularly in the DeFi space, you have to see who's behind the system, what service contracts are in place, who's developed the protocol. We've seen, particularly in the enforcement space, cases where outsourced service providers are located in the US, and that is at least part of the reason why the regulator thinks they can look into you. At the SEC, Chair Gensler has said something about who's writing the software, where's the governance held, who's paying where are the fees being paid, are there promoters, are there sponsors, right? Those are the types of things where even though the protocol is offshore, if it's being managed in the US or supported in the US, that might be enough at least for the agency to take a look, even if they ultimately don't prosecute.
Yeah, that's interesting because the who of DeFi is a topic that comes up often, especially, with all of the anonymous teams out there. What's the general sentiment around these anonymous teams? Is it, something that you think we'll continue to see in the, as we evolve, or do you think we'll see more docs teams?
I'm inclined to say it's the former, that this is good governance, it's transparent, it's objective. Everyone knows or has the chance to know how decisions will be made, and from a operational perspective, it's fair, and it's as transparent as you can be. We have in the U.S. at least one state that has tried to set up a DeFi regime for protocols set up in their state. And so that might create a bit of like a race to the bottom to try and attract people to set up in their state, which is, time will tell how that works, that you set up a DeFi protocol in a state. And so I don't know necessarily if those two things work together. But at some point, we'll either read about a penalty or a rule that will help us better understand how this works. But there sure are a lot of good reasons to have infrastructure in place to support things like this.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm mindful of the time, but let's talk something. We want to learn from you, which is we understand with all the long track record you are involved in regulations, and you yourself is also involved some doing some DeFi stuff and maybe trying some projects. Any specific DeFi projects or protocols that excites you?
Yeah, and even if it's not specific projects, just like specific areas within DeFi.
Yeah, so I guess what I'll answer it this way. What I think is really, really exciting is that there are a lot of legacy operational cracks in the system, and for the first time that I can remember, people are really aggressively trying to solve these problems through technology and across borders and in a way that we've never seen. And so the idea that you can be a part of something bigger than just yourself and your efforts and drawing on problem-solving skills around the world together, the sort of endless opportunity there. And it's like squeezing a balloon, and I know that solving a problem over here will bring a new problem over there. But I think that there's tremendous application here across both sort of traditional finance as well as larger sort of information systems and operational issues. I think that the applications in the DeFi space could go well beyond buying and trading widgets. So I'm very optimistic.
Yeah, I will second on that. I kind of feel, DeFi is not only a decentralized finance, but it's also a format where people and talents can better coordinate and work on a specific target, right? And so far at SynFutures, we have been amazed by the amount of support from our communities, so far, and that would not be possible if we were not building a DeFi project, right? That's my 2 cents on this.
You know, after the financial crisis in the US, we adopted the Dodd-Frank Act, which imposed a lot of new rules. And we saw capital move, and we saw, humans got on airplanes and server stacks were shipped and businesses moved across borders. That same dynamic is at play here. That same competitive component is just as prevalent here, except it can move with the click of a mouse. It's just so much faster, and it's less about what hotels and infrastructure are physically available. It's about the rules of the road and having that certainty and knowing you can do business and grow somewhere. And so, there's a lot happening in this space where people are going to move their businesses and move their capital to the place where they can build and grow.
Well, great. So I think we're just about at the end of our time. So Matthew, thanks again for joining us. Thanks for the insightful conversation. If audience members want to reach out or follow you, where should they go?
So Twitter at Matt_Kulkin, Kulkin. Also Steptoe.com. You can find my bio there.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.